Well, that's no pressure. I do promise it won't be for hours and hours either. But I'm from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I thought before I'd even start, because Chan Zuckerberg has really been around for less than 3 years, I would just share briefly that we have 3 different initiatives. We have the Chan Zuckerberg Science Initiative, Justice and Opportunity, and then Education, which is where I serve. And in education, our vision and our goal is really to make sure that every young person enters adulthood with the knowledge, skills, habits, and agency to contribute to and thrive in a changing world. And the important part there is that we're talking about every. So that means all. And that's really making sure that we're focused on our young people, particularly those who are from more marginalized communities, and making sure that we are serving the adults that serve them. As we've been hearing today, and as we've heard over the last couple, yesterday as well, the future of work is here. It's now. Like, our world is changing, and the speed is not going to slow down. So what does that mean for us? One of the things it means, and we heard Mark Cuban actually mention this earlier today, that we need to be in a cycle where we're continually learning. And what I would also argue is that we need to bring some of what we know about how people learn and learning science into how we are designing and how we are preparing our next generation learners. I've had the really good fortune to have been able to work in a number of different kinds of schools throughout my career, both really under-resourced as well as schools that were really very well resourced, in both working in and outside of the United States. And the one thing that is common across all of those is that you cannot teach something the exact same way and get the same exact results at the exact same time. Every learner is unique, and so we need to actually understand where learners are on their journey. One of the things that I want to share is, like, when I first started teaching, there was 2 girls. I was literally the first year of teaching. I was in North Philadelphia in a really challenged neighborhood in a very challenged school. In fact, all of the doors were locked except for one, and that was really about keeping the drug dealers out and not keeping the students in. It was also eventually ended up being closed because of the level of violence that was in that school. I loved those students very deeply. And there were these 2 girls, though, that really just tried to make my life as miserable as they possibly could. Like, it was just their mission. They're like, they would roll their eyes when I gave an assignment. They would talk over me when I was doing stuff. And they would ask me questions, like, literally the first thing any student ever asked me was, what is some little white girl going to teach me? So there's a lot that was going on there. And I really tried to use every tool, and I was a young teacher, but every tool I had. I stayed after school to work with students to really be able to help them be able to fill the gaps. I did a reward system. I really worked to try to make things as engaging. I should have rated our movie, which you're never allowed to do, but it was about their neighborhood. And so I really was trying to reach them. And most of the kids this worked, but these 2 girls, it just never quite worked. And I couldn't figure it out. But I'll come back to those 2 girls in a few minutes. But what I do, I'm the director of learning science. So first I want to define learning science, because oftentimes people think, oh, you study how people learn science. It's actually, no. It's like a set of sciences that are about how people learn. So I want to just kind of clarify that first. At CZI, we really are interested in how do we get, with evidence and the research we have, how do we get that into tools, into classrooms, and into training? So that's really what our focus is. And one of the ways that we talk about doing this is a process called learning engineering. So that's where you take something about how we know people learn, and that 2-hour training that you put everybody through at your organization is not one of those effective processes. And when you can, using technology, because that really allows you to scale things. And it allows you also to collect more evidence to know when you're on the right track and when you know what's working for whom. And then you kind of keep iterating and making something better. Again, we call that learning engineering. And so the question is well, why engineering? That seems like a different field. But as it turns out, most fields actually have engineers. In biomedicine, we have people who do the more sort of bench science, and then we have people who are biomedical engineers that take that and they translate it into ways that we can actually use it really practical. Same thing for chemistry. We have chemists, and then we have people who are chemical engineers. We even have food engineers. There are people, any food engineers in the room? Okay. But there are people who actually, their process is actually to take what we know about how food works, how to deliver it, how to get it to people, and have it still be fresh. People who actually do that. But we don't really have very many learning engineers. And what that means is that we are not getting what we know about how people learn into classrooms. It's not getting into our training. Literally, we have learned so much in the last 10 years, and it's just not making it. How many of you guys have heard of like left brain, right brain? It doesn't exist. So, it doesn't. You have a left brain and you have a right brain, but one doesn't take care of creativity, one doesn't take care of analytics. So there's a whole bunch of those neuromyths I could go through, but what I want to do is actually just focus on a specific place that I think is a good example of how learning works. So first, like one of the things that, like a key thing about what learning science means in learning is that learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. When you go into a math class, you don't just like, okay, I'm bringing the math part of my brain into class right now. You bring all of your brain. And I work mostly in K-12, but as it turns out, most adults also have brains. It turns out they have similar learning needs. So all of these things are actually really applicable to both to adults and to children. But we think about physical health, mental health, identity development, social emotional, academic, cognitive, all of these things interplay with one another and really impact how well you can learn in a given environment. I could just throw out a couple examples. Like if this room were really, really cold, it'll be hard for you to focus. Actually, I see some people with shawls. If you skipped lunch, again, hard for you to focus. We heard from the California Surgeon General yesterday. She's talking about toxic stress. That has a huge impact on on children and being able to learn, and on adults. If you feel like the thing that you're learning doesn't, like people like you, there's no one who looks like you that does that kind of job, it's harder for you to focus. And so when all of these things are taken into account, it's much easier for us to be successful learners. Also want to recognize that context really matters. And literally our brain works this way. Our brain, to be more effective, needs to know how the pieces fit into the larger whole. And we learn better in the situation that we're going to be using that in. We heard yesterday when people were talking about like learning a sport. You don't have kids sit and read a book about it. You have kids actually try it out. And that's similar for kind of any kind of training or learning. You're more successful if you're actually having people do that and be able to apply it into the situations that they're going to use that in. Similarly, one size does not fit all. You want to think about like how are you going to tailor the needs of whether it's your organization, whether it's children, whether it's the higher ed. You really want to think about like what is it that learners need, and how can you adjust and kind of move everyone through the trajectory that they need to be on. Okay. So now I want to talk about motivation. Because I think this is a great example for how all the different pieces of learning science can kind of come in terms of how we learn. And when I talk about motivation, I don't mean I left really inspired. I actually left inspired by a lot of the people over the last couple of days, and I think probably most of you have too. And it doesn't mean that someone has made something really exciting and that you're really interested in it. And we talk about motivation, it's really more around how do you get the energy and the persistence to start something, to put the mental effort to kind of persist through to the point of being able to learn something. My colleague, Boris Zuckerberg, recently put together a framework that was published with another colleague of his, Richard Clark, that I think does a good example of like helping us think through motivation. I'm missing one. I missed it. So I'll have to talk it through. I think I must have dropped that slide. But essentially, there's kind of 4 different ways to think about it. One of those is attribution, meaning something is in my way. My teacher doesn't like me. My boss doesn't like me. My favorite, I use it all the time, is like, I don't have enough time. So there's something, an obstacle. Another barrier or obstacle can be feeling like you can't do it. Just like a sense of like, I'm not a math person, my family's not math people, I'm not able to tackle this. It could also be that you don't see the point. So you're thinking about, when am I ever going to use that quadratic equation in my life? How many of you used a quadratic equation in your adult lives? Not many. There's a few that are raising your hands, but not many. But that is like if you don't see the connection, it's actually harder for you to put together the mental effort to be able to do that. And then the last one was really around negative emotions. So if your mental state matters in terms of whether or not you're motivated. If you got in a fight with someone in the hall before you walk into a classroom, or you're really not getting along with your boss, like those things will impact whether or not you're able to kind of receive and be able to be ready and prepared to be able to learn. So going back to those 2 girls in that classroom, one day in February, the 2 of them walked me to the office. Now, it seems like a very small thing, but it was actually a huge thing. Other students had walked me around the school all the time just to make sure that I was safe, but these girls had never done that. And on this one day, the one girl said, she made a comment about liking my earrings. And I couldn't figure out what had changed. And from then on, they literally were like my best friends. As it turned out, almost all of these young women's teachers and other adults in their lives had all left. Their substitute teachers all left. They had a ton of substitute teachers in the school. Even their teachers that were supposed to be full-time had all left. That's actually even how I ended up in there, because they had a need for teachers coming in. And for them, they weren't going to put together the energy to commit until they knew I wasn't going away. And the day before, I had talked about a program I'd gotten funding for that I was going to bring back to the school the next year. And so suddenly they felt like, oh, you're not leaving us. And they were able to connect. If I'd understood that earlier, that was the barrier to learning, none of those other techniques worked, because I wasn't actually addressing what was getting in the way of the motivation. Okay. I'm going to do really fast because I am out of time. But essentially, there's that slide. So if anyone wants to take a picture of that slide. I do want to ask one thing about how many of you have ever headed to point A and then found yourself in point B? That's a lot of hands. So I have a question for you. Who was driving the car? If you don't remember how you got there, who was driving? That's a lot of you out there. I don't want to be on the road with you. Although none of you remember driving the car. So one of the things that happens is when you are learning something, when you get to the point where your brain becomes an expert at it, and it becomes more automatic. And that's really kind of the goal of being able to get to being successful learners. Okay. The last thing I want to say is that what's really, really important, the point I want to leave with you, is that as you go through this kind of learning engine engineering process, it's really important to make sure that you're using evidence about our more marginalized learners, and that you're kind of continually updating what's working with whom. And if we do that, then I think that's the way that we can actually prepare our next generation learners. Thank you.